So now that we've completed the balance sheet and the balance sheet is balancing, the last piece is the debt schedule. And the debt schedule is confusing for a lot of people because it's the one that's really not very linear. Whereas you think about the cash flow statement or the balance sheet, project a year. Once you think about 1 year, you just copy everything to the right. This is a little bit different. It's a little bit suggestive. It changes depending on the type of model that you're doing. So for example, when we do the LBO model, it's going to have a big focus on the debt schedule, right, naturally, because it's a leveraged buyout, deals with debt. But I want to introduce it here. And the purpose of the debt schedule is, number one, to manage the debts outstanding. You need a place to do that, a place to model in the types of interest on the different levels of debts, the pay downs of the debts, potential debt raises. You know, we need a separate schedule for that. It also helps manage and track how much cash you have, free cash that's available to pay down the debt, and how you can pay that down in certain order. So a lot of times companies might want to manage themselves in such a way where if you have a cash surplus, you should start paying down your debt. Well, how do we, in an automated and clean way, use that cash to pay down debt with the highest, let's say, highest interest-bearing loans first? And there's a formula for that. So in short, it tracks the debt that you have outstanding, the interest related to that debt, the cash available, whether you can use that cash to pay down debt, and interest that might be received from cash left over. The point of that, aside from managing the debt and the cash, is to fill in the last missing holes in our model, which is interest expense, interest income, which the debt schedule will produce. So it will produce interest expense that will link into our income statement, interest income that will link into our income statement. And if you recall here in the cash flow statement, we've left out line items relating to issuances and payments of debts. So we're going to use the debt schedule to track and manage that. Right? This will create a confusing but necessary circular reference throughout the model. So it's important to understand the circular reference, understand why it's created. It's a necessity, understand what its necessity is. You might be asked this in an investment banking interview. I remember being asked this, how to walk through it. And we'll strengthen that and we'll hone in on that. Let's just build the function of it first. Right? So in terms of progress for this week, today I want to just link this up, link it through. I want to talk a little bit about how it works. Tomorrow, snow conditions permitting, I want to talk about raising debt and raising equity and using this as a tool, really strengthening what the point of it is. If this turns into a WebEx discussion, which it most likely will, I'm going to put that on hold because that's really better for an in-person discussion. And I'll jump to what was going to be Wednesday's topic, which is a little bit of valuation and DCF. And then Thursday is just really moving into valuation, valuing Walmart, using DCF, comps, precedent transactions. Right? And that'll go into next week. Right? And next week is really just concluding on the valuation of Walmart. Right? So by next week, we'll be done with the core valuation of Walmart, and we'll start to slowly get into using this as a tool for buying businesses and getting into M&A. So we'll get into M&A pretty quickly now. Okay, so if you see the core structure of this debt schedule, first thing is this section talking about cash. This is where we're going to determine the cash that we can use to pay down debt. Right? So we have a total amount of cash sitting in our balance sheet. Some of that we might not want to freely expend. Right? So we're going to determine how much cash we actually have to pay down debt. And then we have sections underneath that lay out the different types of debts that we have. So for any company, what you want to do is, because this is a schedule that's not reported in the balance sheet, or I'm sorry, in the financial statements, it's something that we're going to want to create from scratch. We're going to have to look to the balance sheet to determine what types of debts remain outstanding. So if you look at the liabilities, we have short-term debt. We have the current portion of long-term debt. We have current portion of capital leases. I'm going to consider capital leases as debts. We'll talk about them in full. We have long-term debt and capital leases. So we have 5 different pieces of debts. Notice I've kept separate the portion of long-term debt due within a year and the long-term debt. Some people like to combine that. I'm just as explicit as possible, and if there's 5 different line items, I'm going to make 5 different pieces of debts. I don't bother combining it, but just we want to make sure if you're going to combine it here, combine it on the debt schedule. I don't really recommend combining it. I'll show you how to handle it. So there's clearly 5 different pieces here. I'm going to make sure that my debt schedule has 5 different pieces. Short-term debt, short-term portion of long-term debt. When I say pieces, I'll tell you what that means, the components of the pieces. Capital leases due within a year, long-term debt, and the actual capital leases. So the 5 different pieces to match the 5 different pieces of debts as per the balance sheet. At the bottom, we have some totaling line items. So you'll always have the total issuances and retirements, total amount of debts raised and paid down, the total interest from all debts from above. We're going to calculate the cash at the end of the year, the new cash at the end of the year that's going to be calculated from above, and the interest on that cash. So again, it's not a very straightforward schedule. It's a schedule that needs practice, and I don't expect you guys to get it in the first shot, but let's just go through it. So that's the layout, right? So the layout is calculating cash at the beginning of the year, laying out all the different pieces of debts. Here we have 5, and then totaling up some items. The first modeling aspect that I recommend doing is to pull in the last reported ending balances from the balance sheet of each piece of cash and debt. That's the first recommended step. So, in other words, we have cash at the end of the year. I'm going to pull in cash at the end of the year in 2012 from the balance sheet in 2012. That's the last reported balance of cash from the balance sheet. So I'm going to pull in F48 in from, and it equals, go to the balance sheet, 6550, cash and cash equivalents from the top of the balance sheet. It's the last reported 2012 balance sheet number. This is going to be utilized to drive our cash balance in our debt schedule. That's the first step. You guys okay with that? So last reported balances are pulling in. Last reported cash. And I'm going to do the same thing with the balance of debts. So if you notice each piece of debt, I didn't talk about the components of each, but each piece of debt ends with the end of year balance of the debts. So I'm going to pull in the end of year balances from the balance sheet as reported. So capital leases, long-term debt on the capital leases, the end of year will equal from the balance sheet long-term debt due within 1 year. Sorry. Capital leases, long-term debt obligations under capital leases. I'm just matching the words, right? That's the last reported balance of capital lease debt. That's going to be used to drive our balance next year. We'll do the same with every piece of debt. Long-term debt end of the year is going to be pulled in from the balance sheet. Long-term debt. And so on. Capital leases due within 1 year will be pulled in from balance sheet. Capital leases due within 1 year at 326. And I'll continue with long-term debt due within 1 year. Pulled in from balance sheet. Long-term debt due within 1 year. And finally, short-term debt, one from the balance sheet, short-term borrowings. So we've pulled in all the last reported balances of debts and cash that will be used to drive our next year. Questions on that? You guys okay? And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to build out each balance of debt. When I say build out, this is what I mean. So each piece of debt has the following sections. First, let's take short debt, for example, the beginning of your balance. What's the beginning of your balance? Right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to assume, and you have to, that the balance of debt reported on January 1st of next year is the same amount as what was been reported on December 31st of the year before. There's only a day in between, and we assume that that balance isn't going to change. So the beginning of your balance is going to be equal to the ending prior year balance. So that we're going to do an ongoing balance, a rolling balance of debt going forward. That's the way we're going to model out each debt in the debt schedule. Right? Beginning of balance next year equals end of year balance the year before. Got that? It's a rolling balance. Then we have two types of issuances and retirements, right? No matter what the type, an issuance is a positive number, is debt being raised, cash being raised. Negative retirement is a pay down, right? Is a negative number, is debt being paid down. We separate two for a mechanical reason, right? There are mandatory issuances and non-mandatory issuances. The mandatory issuances are known as the principal payments, which have been contracted as necessary to be paid down year after year. You raise a long-term debt of which, let's say, a lot of people say, well, $1 billion is required to be paid down each year. That's contractual, that cannot be changed. That's mandatory. The non-mandatory is going to be kind of more of a modeling tweak. This is something that we're going to figure out a formula for. The non-mandatory is the idea that if we have excess cash to pay down debt above and beyond what's mandatory, we may choose to pay down some of these debts. And there's going to be an automatic formula that's going to determine how much cash do we have after all necessary payments. Do we have excess cash? If we have excess cash, do we have the ability to pay down short-term debts? And we don't want that whole complicated formula to interfere with the mandatory issuances to payments. So that's why we separate out the two line items. So from an accounting perspective, the idea is the same. An issuance is money being raised, debt being raised. A retirement is money being paid back, debt being paid back. But one is predefined payments, preset payments, contractual. The other is automatic. For now, we'll keep them zero all the way through, and we'll, in the modeling part of it, we'll show you how they work. But for now, no matter what, whether it's mandatory or non-mandatory or issuances or retirements, the short-term balance at the end of the year is going to be a sum of above. Because an issuance would be a positive number, a pay down would be negative, right? So if you're going to issue it, put a positive number in there, the debt balance is going to increase, negative, debt balance is going to decrease. So it's always going to be a quick all equals, sum of everything from above. Real simple. So for each piece of debt, we want to do that. We want to take the beginning of short-term debt, which equals the end of year from the year before. Issuances and retirements, let's keep it zero for now. Short-term debt, end of the year, will be a sum of everything from above. And then we calculate interest. Now, for now, I just want to focus on the mechanics. We're going to get into, in a second, mining through Walmart data to find out, we're going to try to approximate what the interest expense they have is. Let's make the interest rate 5% for now. Anything random. I'm just going to pick that up from nowhere. So G17, hard code 5%, and we're going to calculate the interest. To calculate the interest, we take the average. I always take the average balance of the prior year and the year before. So in other words, interest is obviously the balance of debt times the interest rate. But if there is a major debt pay down, let's say $4 billion, maybe we might get negative $4 billion, right, representing that the debt's paid down. I hard code negative $4 million, $4 billion, guess what? My short-term debt goes down by 47. Right? If I were to calculate 5% on that 47, that means throughout the whole year, I've had a little bit of interest, which could kind of make sense because I don't have much debt outstanding. The question is, when did I pay down that $4 billion? If I paid down that $4 billion at the very beginning of the year, then yeah, for 360 days out of the year, I only had $47. But if I paid down that $4 billion on, let's say, December 30th, then maybe for the majority of the year, I didn't have $47. Maybe for the majority of the year, I had $4 billion, and for one day in the year, I only had $47. Timing becomes an issue, and so what we do generally, because we don't know exactly when these paydowns occur, we just average the ending balances from the year before and the current year as an indicator of just smoothing out the time. If you want to be more accurate at the time, you can tweak it, or you can build a monthly model, or you can build a daily model if you really want to, right? But so generally, because we don't know exactly when that debt's going to pay down throughout the year, we take an average. So the interest formula is always equals average, open parentheses, this year, comma, the year before, right? Close parentheses times the rate. And enter, and then we copy everything to the right. So make sure you get that. I'm going to save this. And then I want to get into more accurate interest rate. So let me now pull up the Walmart annual report, because I want to see what kind of interest rates for each piece of debt the company's been producing. Sometimes you can't get that information, so I'm going to show you with each piece of debt a little bit of a different method, because you're going to face completely different situations depending on what transaction you're working on, etc. So I'm going to do a quick word search for debt. Let's see what comes up. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to hopefully look for a debt schedule. Oops. Next. Here they talk about their balances of debt and the weighted average interest rate. That could be useful, although I remember, and I looked at this and considered this, but after spending time researching, I found a better table that was a little bit more explicit. You could have used this piece of debt, this table. A lot of word. Here it is. No, that's not it. That's a different type of classification. Okay, I believe these are the pay downs. Here it is. Here it is. I liked this because, as opposed to the others, because it showed the timing of each debt from here on out further, and it showed the short term and the long term. The other ones were, I went through really quick because I didn't want to spend too much time dwelling on it, but if you were to do this on your own, one just focused on the short term debt, one just focused on the long term. This is a nice one that kind of encompassed everything. But you're going to have to do some research and pine through with your own companies that you're working on to figure out what the interest would be. Now, short-term debt is pretty straightforward. There's 4047. It matched our 4047 right here. And it listed explicitly that the interest on that is 0.1%. Now, 0.1% might seem quite low, right? That's not the actual contractual interest, but they're calculating the idea that this is going to be paid down in a short amount of time. So we want to do the same. So just note that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have 0.1%. I'm going to cover that going forward. You might think, well, next year that debt might go away because it's going to be paid down. We'll deal with pay downs in a second or a little bit later. Let's just do the interest on those debts. 0.1%. Once you have that, $4 million of interest, let's move on to the long-term debt due within 1 year. So I want you to take a look at that and try to build it out as we had just done the short-term debt, right, where we're taking the beginning of year short-term debt equals the prior year from the year before. Right, so Beginning of the year short-term debt equals debt from the year before, 1975. Let's assume issuances and retirements are 0 for now. And we'll add everything up. Real straightforward. I guess you can copy this to the right if you choose. So for the interest rate here, we've got to go back to that table. And this is a little tricky because here they show the long-term debt. Here's the outstanding balance, $44 billion, right, total, all the way on the right. On the left for 2013, remember what we're dealing with right now is just the portion of long-term debt that's due within 1 year. And it shows 1975. You see here, they broke it down into two pieces. There's a portion of the debt that comes with a fixed rate. There's a portion of the debt that comes with a variable rate, 1475 and 500. Notice the sum of the 1475 and the 500 equals the 1975, which is the value that's reported here. I guess you could have broken that out, but I didn't do that. So I used a different method here. So what I did was I backed into what the implied interest expense would have been if I took the 1475, multiplied it by the 4.8%, plus the 500 at 5.2%. What is that implied interest rate? Sorry, what is that implied interest expense? And then divided to get the implied interest rate. It's one way. There's a couple ways to do it. But I took basically a weighted average. I took a blend. So I said, the way I did it was I hard-coded directly in the interest expense. I did 1475, and I had it blue as a hard code. If you're going to do this for a deal or transaction, I'd comment where it came from, times 4.8%, plus 500 times 5.2%. That gave me 96.8. So the interest based on that 1975, those two rates, is 96.8%. And you can divide to get the implied rate, which is 4.9%. Another way to have done this is just to do the weighted rate right in cell G23. Just do the division right in here and do it backwards. So there's two ways to do it. It's the same thing. We'll do it the other way down below. I'm trying to show you different ways for each one. You okay with that? So I basically determined from here, this is the 1975, the 1475 500, the 1475 was at 4.8, 500 was at 5.2, so I took away that average. Divided to get 4.9. So I'm going to say, okay, well that was 4.9, I'm going to use 4.9 going forward now. So for 2014, I'm going to hard code 4.9. Okay, I guess in the book I didn't hard code 4.9. I did H24 equals to G24. It gives you a little bit of a rounding difference. It would be 4.9356, whatever it could be. So just to match the numbers specifically, that'll adjust it a little bit. H24 equals G24. And then I use the standard interest expense formula to back into what the interest expense would be going forward, which should be 96.8. But when we do issuances and pay downs and when that's changed, this will change. So equals average open parentheses, this year, comma last year, times the rate. Right? So I took H24 as equal to D24, then took the average this year and last year times the rate, copy that to the right. And so you want to make sure you're using the Walmart report to dig up as much accurate information about the rates as possible. Sometimes the company won't produce or won't talk about the rates into this level of detail. They might just talk about the spread above LIBOR. If they do, look up what the LIBOR rate is. You can Google that. Right? They might say, well, our short-term debt is 2 points above LIBOR. So look up what the LIBOR is and add 2% to that. Sometimes they won't talk about the rates at all. You might have to look at comps for what their rates could be. If it's a big public company like Walmart, sometimes you can go to like Morningstar. They'll have public debt rates. Just Google, Walmart debt rates, for example. You might see, if they have big bonds that are trading, you can see what the yield is. You can use that yield as the interest rates. So you might have to do some of your own research. Capital leases, same idea. Capital lease this year equals capital lease from the year before. This is, sorry, the capital lease is due within the year. Zero mandatory, non-mandatory issuance retirements. Doing alt equals. Copy everything to the right. Now the capital leases, everyone have this? Capital leases are difficult because they didn't mention anything about rates here. So you might see this you might see something like this. What I did was, this is a method that I usually rarely recommend for a specific reason that I'll get into, but what I did was I had realized that the total value of capital leases, which was 3009 plus 326, 3335, right? The total value of capital leases, the current portion and the long-term portion. You could divide the interest expense into that to get what the implied rate is. Now, a lot of you guys as analysts suggest doing that, and that's usually a very bad idea. Because usually this interest expense is a blend of all the interest from the short-term debt, maybe a revolver, current portion of long-term debt, long-term debt. So usually the idea of taking the interest expense and dividing it by the balance of long-term debt won't give you an accurate percentage. But in this case, what's unique is they actually explicitly separated out the interest expense just to those capital leases. So the interest expense to those capital leases divided by the actual value of those capital leases would give you a pretty close approximation of what the capital leases are. Usually why it doesn't work is because the interest expense is one lump sum of all the pieces of debts. If your company has one interest expense and one piece of debt, then yeah, maybe you can back solve. But most of the time that's not the case. Most of the time you have one interest expense line for a lot of different pieces of debt. So usually that won't work. But in this case it does work. So in this case what I'm going to do is I'm going to back into what the historical interest expense is by taking the 288 and dividing it by not just the 2012 long-term capital leases, but the 2012 long-term capital leases plus the current portion of long-term capital leases. And I'm not going to just take the 288 divided by the 2012 capital leases, but an average of the 2012 and 2011 balance to get a good, accurate percentage. And so I'm going to do that and create that formula and vary it in. And I'm just going to assume for now that the current portion rate and the long-term rate is going to be the same. That's just the way I'm going to do it. So where are we here? So for capital leases here, I'm going to back into the interest rate by taking equals in the book I hard-coded it, but I'll link it so you see exactly where it's coming from. It's going to be, I'm going to take how I assumed last year's rate was calculated by taking the income statement, the 288, it's the interest on all the capital leases, divided by open parentheses, average, open parentheses again. I might not have needed that first open parentheses, that might be redundant, but okay, it's still working the way. The average of the balance sheet, the 2012 and 2011 balances. But I'm going to take the 2012 where's the long term? Capital leases of 3009 plus the amount due within 1 year, right, comma, 2011, which is a 3150, plus the current due within 1 year, and then double close parentheses. I don't think I needed that first open parentheses. It gives me 8.4%. So here's the formula again. So I took the interest expense divided by the average balance of this year and last year. The thing about the average balance is I took the current portion plus the long-term portion. So it's income statement F28 divided by average AVERAGE, open parentheses, 2012, current capital leases plus short-term capital leases, comma, 2011, capital leases plus short-term capital leases, close parentheses. That gave me an implied rate. They must have been paying a blended rate of 8.4%. Again, I strongly am against using this method unless it's the last option. The only reason why I consider it allowable here is because they actually identified the interest rate, the interest expense on that specific piece of debt, which is rarely done. Usually in companies, you have one big interest rate line item for 5 different types of debts, so backing into it won't work. Well, that'll give you a blended interest rate for everything, and that's not really what you want. So I'm going to use that rate to back into the interest rate in that year, which would be equal to the average, open parentheses, this year, comma, last year, times the rate. 27.5 on the current portion of long-term debt. Does that match what we have here? Yes. And so we can copy the interest expense formula to the right. You do not want to copy the interest rate formula to the right, so you can either anchor everything, or I'm going to have H31 equal to G31. Right? Be careful, you can't just copy G31 to the right. You can't copy that to the right. So that's one way to do it. And again, just like depreciation expense, we got to make sure that the total interest expense right now, status quo, we're not paying down, raising debts, should fall in line with the interest expense from the year before. A lot of times I see you guys coming up with all these creative ideas for interest expense or interest rates, and let's say the interest expense has dropped tremendously, or it jumped tremendously, but your debt levels haven't changed. Something to look out for. Something's wrong. You guys have this? No? Call?
I swear I did exactly what you did, but I'm getting 27.4 on my carryover.
Because you,
I didn't do that.
because you didn't do equal, so you just hard code it equal.
Yeah, I just swear that's what I did.
Is it easy, right?
He's correct.
Good.
Of course. Yes, it's true.
Okay. Long-term debt. Long-term debt beginning of the year this year equals long-term debt from the year before. Mandatory issuances. Just hard coding at 0. Doing alt equals. Copy everything to the right. Okay. And something strange happens here that I couldn't figure out. See this a lot in financial reporting. They have 44.092 in fixed rate long-term debt and 1.7 in variable rate. So that's 45.7 of long-term debt. We have 44.07. I don't know why. It just doesn't add up. It's strange. And I couldn't figure it out. I figured, well, what that doesn't include the portion of the current portion. I tried all different permutations of it. If you can find out, let me know. I couldn't back into why they reported on the balance sheet 44070, but here it's 45770. I tried all the obvious things, subtracting the current portion. I don't know what the difference is. So what do? Right? That means you couldn't use 4.6% because that's just the variable portion of fixed portion of it. Anyway, 2% is just the variable portion. So what I did was I just said, well, if the balance was 45.7 billion, what's the blended interest rate? And I'm just going to apply that blended interest rate to my 44.070. Right? So what I did was I backed into what the implied interest rate would have been if my balance was actually 45.7 billion. So I'm going to do 44,092 times 4.6% plus 1,770 times 2% divided by the sum of 44,092 plus 1,770. That gives me a blended interest rate on this $45 billion balance. I'm going to use that interest rate towards my balance. This is a different method. And I'm just going to hard put that in right in the interest rate. So I'm going to do equals 44,092, 44,092. I should put this in parentheses. So open parentheses. 44,092 times 4.6%. Okay. Plus 1,770 times 2%. That's going to give me the interest rate on 45 billion, right? I want 44 billion. So I'm going to divide this by, in parentheses, the balance, the $45 billion balance, to give me my implied rate, right? So divided by 44,092 plus 1,770. And that'll give me my rate that I'll apply to the 44 billion. So again, it's 44,092 times 4.6% plus 1,770 times 2% divided by 44092 plus 1770. 4.5%. Makes sense for long-term debt, right? 4 or 5%. It's lower, but it's $44 billion. So you think the larger the balance, maybe the lower the risk for a bigger company. Capital leases have a higher percentage to it. Could be seen as a higher risk security. So we're now going to back into what the implied rate is based on that 4.5%, with the implied interest expenses. So the average, open parentheses, this year, comma last year, times the rate. And I can copy everything to the right. I can copy this 4.5 formula to the right because all those formulas are hard codes are not going to change, or I could do H38 equals G38, either way. You guys have that? Okay. All right. Capital leases. Now we dealt with the short-term capital leases. We used a blended rate. So we're, for the capital leases as a whole, so we use the same 8.4%. So for capital leases at the beginning of the year equals prior year, end of year capital leases. We'll assume mandatory, non-mandatory issues are 0 for now. We'll sum everything up. And for the rate, we'll just have the rate, we'll just do equals the rate that we calculated from above. This is going to be the same rate. That's the way we thought about it. And I'll back into the rate by taking the average this year, comma last year, times the 8.4%. And we'll copy this to the right. Okay, so now that we have all the 4 pieces of debt, we want to just total up some line items here. And you see there's a line item called total issuances, and this is just literally a sum of all the issuances from above, both the mandatory and non-mandatory. So this will simply be equals, I'm going to start from the top, the short-term mandatory plus non-mandatory, the long-term mandatory plus non-mandatory, etc. Current portion of capital leases, long-term under capital leases. That's it. It's going to be 0 for now because we haven't dealt with raising the debt yet. And we want to do the same for interest expense, right? Interest expense is a sum of each level of interest expense, the short term, plus the long term due within 1 year, plus capital lease obligations, plus the long term debt interest, plus the capital leases. Copy that to the right. Now, one thing we can do is, if we've calculated interest expense, is we can start linking interest expense back into the income statement. But if you notice, we've calculated a total interest expense line. The income statement has separated it into two pieces. So I'm going to link it in a little bit different here. I'm going to link in the interest expense just from the capital leases, from the capital lease line, and the interest expense from the remaining debts here. So I'm going to calculate it in a different way. G27, I'm going to hit equals. And on the debt schedule, it's going to be the short-term debt plus the long-term debt due within 1 year plus the long-term debt. Just those three pieces, right? Just the ones that are not related to capital leases. 2083.8. Then the interest on capital leases, I'm going to link in from the debt schedule. $27.5 plus the 254.1. So if you notice, and I'm going to copy this to the right, okay? If you notice, the balance is very much in line with before. So we're doing okay. That's what I expect to see. But again, sometimes when you guys do this, you'll see a big jump or a big increase. You must have done something wrong. Your expense assumptions, your interest rate assumptions are off. All right, this is before we've done any major debt issuances or pay downs. Now let's go back to the debt schedule. So now what happens, let's say, well, actually, let's deal with the cash. Forgotten we didn't do that. Well, once we do the balances of debts, let's take a look at the cash available to pay down the debt. We add an ongoing balance of debts. We also need to build an ongoing balance of cash. We want to determine how much cash do we have that we can use to freely pay down debt. So that begins with cash at the beginning of the year. Cash at the beginning of the year, just like the debt, is going to be equal to cash at the end of the year from the year before, which is one of the first links that we put in. So G7 is going to be equal to from the year before F48. Ongoing balance of cash. Now we have this line, cash flow before debt paydown. So we didn't talk about this yet. If you notice, this is on the cash flow statement. There's a line all the way at the bottom of the cash flow statement called cash flow before debt paydown. This is a measure of cash that excludes any cash from raising or paying down debts. Why do we want to track this? Because it's the purpose of the debt schedule to determine how much cash we can use to pay down debts. We don't want to double count that by showing a number of cash that already includes issuing and pay down debts. So we want to recalculate the measure of cash that excludes any line items that deal with issuing or paying down debts. So this cash flow, this total change of cash equivalents includes total cash and financing activities, which includes any line items related to raising and paying down debts. So we want to recalculate a measure of cash that excludes those line items. So cash flow before the pay down is going to be a sum of everything from above, excluding those three major line items that relate to issuing and paying down debts. So it's going to be cash from operating, plus cash from investing, plus all the individual line items in the financing activities, not including the capital leases. Make sense? So it looks the same now, but once these lines become populated, you'll see a difference. And you can't do this cash minus the debts because that's going to create a circular reference, right? You want to just make sure that you're just re-adding up all the line items and excluding those line items altogether. So again, the numbers are going to look the same, but they will be different once that's become populated. You guys have that? This will be linked into the debt schedule. So the cash flow before that pay down, G8, is going to link in from the cash flow statement, G41. Everybody have that? Then we have minimum cash cushion. And this is something that I think is difficult to determine what it should be. I mean, basically this is, we're going to calculate how much cash we can utilize and expend. And sometimes, most of the time, you don't want to expend all your cash. You need to maintain a minimum balance on your balance sheet. How much could that be? Well, that could be, some people look at that as a percentage of working capital. Some people, really, a lot of times, that's just what your lenders require you to have as to maintain on your balance sheet to be able to hold outstanding that type of debt, which is maybe 1 or 2 times interest payments. You're not going to get that information in the annual report. They're not going to disclose that. It's just not something to disclose. What you could do, though, or the only thing you really have is just to kind of eyeball. If you go in the back, if you go back from the balance sheet 5, 6 years, you'll see that Walmart's maintained $5, $6, $7 billion always. So you could have a minimum cash cushion of about $5 billion, assuming that they're not trying to dip below that. That's what you could do. Just kind of track what they've been maintaining historically. What I did in the book, and in hindsight, I'm not quite sure why, but I made it very low. I made it $1 billion. Let's just do that for now. It's never going to get to those dangerous levels anyway, so it's not going to impact anything. But really, the important thing is to note what this means for the cash that's available to pay down the debt. The cash that we have is 6550, which is the cash at the beginning of the year. That's the last reported balance. Plus 3457. That's all the cash generated this year, excluding cash from debts. So it's important to think about what this means. Plus the cushion. So wiping out the cushion. So in other words, I can pay, or I have $5.8 million that I can spend. And if I spend it all, I'll still have a maintenance amount of $1 billion on my balance sheet. That's the point. So we can copy all this to the right. And this is what you should get. It's going to be 0 for 2014 because we didn't calculate cash at the end of the year yet. I want to talk about that. But before I do, I want to take a look at something. So I have $5.8 or $5.9 billion to pay down debt. Right? So let's say I do. Let's say, all right, well, I can pay down, let's do something bigger, my long-term debt. I'm going to pay down, let's see what I got. 5895.7. Let's say I pay down $5 million of that. So how do I do that? I go to my mandatory issuances, and I hit minus $5 million. 5, 1, 2, 3. Right, $5 million. Debt goes down. What happens to the cash? What happens to the cash? It'll go down. What was it before? Before, it was 58957. Before it was 58957. Pay down $5 billion. What just happened? Thanks. Why not?
Because we didn't link it in the cash flow.
Not necessarily. Why is it going up? Say it again. Remember, this is cash before the debt paid down. Right? So the impact of the paying down the $5 million debt won't be in this number. This is cash before debt paid down. But so then what's making it go up? Interest expense decreases. So walk me through that. This is the circular reference. You pay down debt, so that doesn't impact this. This is cash before debt pay down. But the interest expense has decreased. It was like 2,330. It decreased from 2.3 to 1877. What does that do? How does that make the cash go up, though? Interest decreases. So what happens?
So in the income statement, the net income goes up.
On the income statement, net income goes up. Interest decreases, net income goes up. Then what happens?
So the cash flow, net income goes up.
Net income goes up, drives the cash flow statement. Cash flow goes up. What else happens?
So the balance sheet, cash goes up.
On the balance sheet, cash goes up. So what number is actually changing there?
Oh, this is the cash before paying down debt. So since in the cash flow our net income has gone up, we have more money to pay down the debt.
That's true. But you didn't. So, but my question was, so what here changed? So in other words, we paid $5 billion. Interest expense has gone down. That's for sure. So you go to the income statement. The reduction in interest expense has increased net income. The increase in net income increases cash flow from operations. You increase cash flow from operations, it increases cash flow before debt pay down. That's this number. Yeah. this number, this is the number. This won't change because this is last year's cash. It's this year's cash. It's gone up by a little bit because of the interest expense savings. So in other words, I had 4895.7. Now I actually have a little bit more cash that I can use to pay down a little bit more debt. So let's say we get the idea of paying down $5 billion. Let's say I want to pay down all I can. I want to use all the cash I possibly can. So let's go back to the base case here where I have 5895.7. Right? So I'm going to go to the long-term debt. I'm going to pay down 5895.7. 5895.7. That interest expense has gone down, right? It was 1983. It goes down to 1850. Interest expense goes down. Net income goes up. Net income goes up. Cash goes up. So my cash goes from 5895.7 to 5988.7 due to the interest and tax savings. So I actually have a little bit more cash that I can use to pay down a little bit more debt. So let me do that. So how much more cash do I have? Well, I'm gonna iterate this. I have 5895.7 plus, I don't know if I can do, yeah, so I have here 93. I have a difference of 93. I have 93 more, I just add them together. I have 93 more in after-tax interest savings that I can use to pay down more debt. So I'm going to do negative 93. So now what happens? Debt goes down more, interest goes down a little bit more. Interest goes down a little bit more, cash goes up a little bit more. Right? Interest goes down, then it goes up, cash goes up. I have a little bit more cash. I could pay down a little bit more debt. Right? I had paid down 59887. It's now gone up to 59902. So that's an additional savings of 1.5. It's $1.5 million. So I can put down 1.5 million more. So let me do that. So I'm going to do minus 1.5 million. Interest goes down more. Interest goes down more. Net income goes down more. Net income goes up more, sorry. Net income goes up more. Cash goes up more. So now my cash goes up to 59902. I guess it does. So I don't think there's any. Is there maybe a decimal difference? There's 0 here. But maybe there's a decimal difference. So as I pay down debt, within that period, there's interest savings, which will free up cash to pay down a little bit more debt. That causes an iterative calculation. This is where the circular reference is in the model. So it's important to understand that because once we link this through fully, some of your models might have an error message that pops up. It's Excel warning you that you have a circular reference thing. It's an error. You've got to go and check a box and say, no, it's okay. We've intentionally done that. So you want to check a box to say, allow circular references to calculate through. So to find that, you can go to, if you have the older Excel with the circle symbol with the 4 windows, you can click that. Or you click this file here. And then go to options. Either one will have an options box. If you go to options, you go to formulas. Here, calculation options. It says enable iterative calculation. Allow circular references to exist and go through iterations. We went through our own iterations. We went through 3 iterations. They're saying, how many iterations do you want to go through? I often do a maximum of 100. That's it. Maximum 100 iterations. You just want to make sure that that box is checked. If you don't check that box, an error message is going to pop up and say, there's an error in your model, there's a circular reference. We want the circular reference. Now, let's keep that in there. If you didn't follow me, that's okay. But still, if that's 0 on your model, then that's fine. But what I do want to do is I want to calculate the cash at the end of the year. So even if that's 0, you can still calculate cash at the end of the year with me. How would you calculate cash at the end of the year using the pieces from above? How would you think about calculating cash at the end of the year? Think about it. What would you utilize?
Well, cash at the beginning of the year.
Let's start with cash at the beginning of the year, naturally. This is the cash from last year.
Plus the cash flow before that pay down.
Plus the cash flow before that pay down. This is all the cash generated this year, but it excludes something. Right? It excludes the debt that we've raised or the debt that we've paid down. We need to include that piece. So where do we get that piece?
Minus down at the bottom.
Yep. The total issuances and retirements. So think about a timeline, right? We have the cash at the beginning of the year. This is the cash we started with. Plus all the cash generated this year, but that cash excludes any debts raised or paid down. So we need to just add to that, add to that the amount of cash that's been raised or paid down, which is this. If this is zero in your model, that's fine. Still link it up anyway. Notice the cash at the end of the year is 1,000. It's the minimum cash cushion because I've paid down all the debt that I could. So if I make this zero, which is what you most likely have, then the cash at the end of the year should be 68957. We copy this to the right. You should have all 18389.0. Okay. Now notice one thing. If you let's pay down $5 million altogether. So if we go into G34 and say let's pay down $5 million debt, 5000. Pay that down. Notice the model isn't matching anymore. This match checks to make sure our debt balance, our cash balance here that we're calculating from above matches the cash balance from our balance sheet. That's an important match because it proves that something isn't linking properly. What's not linking properly? The pay down. Right? Once we put the pay down in, it stopped matching. What about the pay down is not linking properly? Cole mentioned the cash flow statement. So if you recall on the cash flow statement, we paid down $5 million in debt. We should see that in the financing activities of the cash flow statement. It's not. It's not here. So the final link in a full-scale model is that the issuances and retirements of each piece of debt should be linked into the cash flow statement. So short-term debt here needs to reflect the issuances and retirements that we might have from the debt schedule. Right? Now we have two types of issuances and retirements. We have mandatory and non-mandatory. So let's sum them together. So in other words, the short-term debt should be equal to the sum from the debt schedule of the mandatory plus non-mandatory short-term debt bonds. So that means if we decide to raise debt in the short-term debt, it'll go into the cash flow statement, it'll raise the debt, it'll flow into the balance sheet. We'll draw out those flows again to finalize tomorrow or the day after. Long-term debt, same thing, should be equal in from the debt schedule, the long-term debt, issuances, and retirements, including that $5 billion. So you'll see how that captures the $5 billion. So what happens now, that's going to capture the $5 billion. If you link that in properly, look at what happens. That'll capture the $5 billion. That's what was making our match, throwing our match off, which means our total change in cash and cash equivalents is negative $4 billion. Notice that's now different than our cash flow before debt paydown, because this captures the paydown of debt. This is before the paydown of debt. But it's this $5 billion that'll flow into our balance sheet. We'll work on raising debts and paying debts and how it all flows through, in the next coming days. We also have the capital leases. Capital leases link in from the debt schedule. Long-term obligations under capital leases. The sum of the mandatory and non-mandatory. Come back to the right. I'm going to take the highlights, the yellow highlights out of here because we've linked these already. The yellow highlights we had put in the very beginning when we realized that we still have links to come.
What about the long term and the capital lease due within a year?
Yeah, so once you have this, you'll notice there are two debt pieces, the current portion of long-term debt and the current portion of lease obligations that we've created here, of which there's no cash flows for it. We need to add our own cash flows for that. And that's a tricky thing. We've identified in the balance sheet 5 pieces of debt as defined in the balance sheet, but there weren't 5 cash flows relating to that. I don't know why the company just didn't choose to report that. So we should add 2 rows. So I'm going to do above long-term debts, I'm going to do shift space bar to hide the row, and then control shift plus twice. One for current, and I'm going to write out current portion of long-term debt, and one for current portion of capital lease obligations. So I didn't use the exact language. You should probably use the exact, what do they call it exactly on the balance sheet? They called it long-term debt due within 1 year. All right, so fine. So long-term debt due within, now I'm being too particular, due within 1 year. And then they did obligations under capital leases due within 1 year. So obligations under capital leases due within 1 year. And since they didn't have those line items historically for the cash flow statement, it's going to be 0, 0, 0. And now we have something to link into those respective mandatory and non-mandatory issues and retirements. Because if we were ever to raise or pay down a current portion of long-term debt, it would have never flown through. So for every debt that you've identified in the debt schedule, you have to make sure that there's a cash flow statement line item for that reflects it, and a balance sheet line item that reflects that. So for the long-term debt due within 1 year, this should be equal to, from the debt schedule, long-term debt due within 1 year, mandatory and non-mandatory. Copy that to the right. For the capital leases due within 1 year, this should link in from debt schedule. Obligations under capital leases due within 1 year, mandatory plus non-mandatory. So now we have a cash flow statement line item for every debt that we've raised. And you want to make sure that each of those cash statement line items link in from the debt schedule. You also want to make sure that the financing activities includes those line items. I realize it doesn't. Well, historically it happens to me, but in the future it doesn't include those line items. I'll make sure the totals work out. So the total needs to include. So add to the total cash financing activities the plus long debt due within 1 year and the capital lease obligations due within 1 year. That's okay? And you want to make sure that the cash flow before that pay down continues to exclude those line items because those are line items related to debts. You guys okay with that? Yeah? And then, again, you want to make sure there's a line item. If there's 5 pieces of debts, there's got to be 5 cash flow statement line items that reflect it, and then 5 balance sheet line items that reflect it. So we got to go back to the balance sheet now and make sure that everything is flowing properly, meaning that there are 5 pieces of debts that reflect the debt schedule debts, and that properly link in from the cash flow statement. So short-term debt borrowings, issued debt from the year before, plus cash flow statement G29, which is should be the short-term debt borrowings. That works. Long-term debt due within 1 year. Right now equals the year before. Needs to flow in from the cash flow statement, the new cash flow statement line that we created. So this needs to be equal to the year before plus the cash flow statement line item, so that if we were ever to pay down debt, it would flow through the whole model. So right now, G24 equals F24. We need to add to this plus cash flow statement, the long-term debt due within 1 year, G30. So we need to make sure that that cash flow statement is flowing properly into the balance sheet. Copy that to the right. Obligations under capital leases due within 1 year should be equal to the year before plus the obligations under capital leases from the cash flow statement, the new line item, obligations under capital leases that we've created, G31. Hit enter. Copy that to the right. So we're checking to make sure, again, if you have 5 debt schedule items, you got to have 5 cash flow statement line items in the financing activities. You got to have 5 balance sheet line items that drive from those 5 cash statement line items. Right? So we had to check to make sure of that. Some of those line items already existed. We realized 2 didn't. Long-term debt is working properly. Equals long debt from the year before plus cash flow statement long-term debt. Capital lease obligations is working properly. Capital lease obligations from the year before plus capital lease obligations from the cash flow statement. So now everything is working properly, and so now our model should match again. And it does. So the model is done. The model is complete. If we zero out G34, we can, it'll still match, right? We haven't dealt with issuances and paydowns yet. We'll deal with that tomorrow. Notice there's still this final line item, interest income, which is the little bit of income that's based on cash that's sitting on your balance sheet. The way we calculate that is much like interest expense. It's equal to the average, open parentheses, this year and last year's cash, this year comma last year's cash at the end of the year, times the interest rate. Right now the interest rate is blank, which is 2 times G50. And the question here, again, you're going to find difficulty in figuring out what is the exact interest rate on the cash that they're holding in their bank account. Right? And some of this, remember, cash on your balance sheet is not always cash sitting in a bank account. It's cash and cash equivalents, which is anything that can be liquidated immediately. So it could be short-term investments or investments in CDs or mutual funds. It's a blended interest on all of that. And a lot of times, again, that's a number that's not often reported. So what I typically do is, just like with depreciation, I figure out what is a rate that backs into a rate that's similar to what the interest expense has been previously. So historically, their interest expense was about 162, or 200 to 162, based on their balance of cash and what they're buying, what they're selling. So if I do like a 2% rate, it's 134.5. I'm trying to think about what I did in the book. I thought I did 1.5%. That wouldn't make sense to me because it went up. If I did 3%, that gives me 200. It's a little high. If I did 2.5%, that's 168.1. That's pretty much in line with what they had before, 162, 168. So I decided to stick with that. That's the best you can do at this point, unless they give you more information. So I kind of backed into what would be a rate that's similar to, or that falls in line with what they've been producing before at the base levels, right before issuances and pay downs and anything else like that. So now we link this in to the income statement. And so notice on the income statement, we're showing income as a negative because it offsets the expense. So I'm going to pull this in as a negative from the debt schedule, negative 168.1. I'll copy this to the right. I'll take the highlights out. The model's done. Now I got to tweak it. Now I got to adjust the assumptions, adjust the growth. How do you look at this? How do you read this? How do we make this fall in line with the street? What happens when we raise more debt? What happens when we do some debt paydowns? How do we deal with automatic debt paydowns? Right? We didn't deal with all that. So we'll start looking at that stuff tomorrow.